Retouch and repair photos. Retouch and repair photos. Using a variety of Photoshop tools, you can easily touch up blemishes, whiten teeth, correct red eye, and fix many other imperfections in your images. And do not be careful. By the way, Photoshop doesn't support opening or editing banknotes or currency notes, and see counterfeit deterrence system (CDS). And what about the clone source panel? Clone source panel in Photoshop. By the way, the clone source panel, you should to choose Windows, then choose clone source, and has options for the clone stamp tools or healing brush tools. You can set up to 5 different sample sources and quickly select the one you need without resampling each time you change to a different source. And you can also view an overlay of your sample source to make it easier to clone the source in a specific location. And also you can scale or rotate the sample source to better match the size and orientation of the cloning destination. And for timeline-based animations, the clone source panel also has options for specifying the frame relationship between the sample source video and animation frame and the target video and animation frame, and you can see also cloning content in video and animation frames. So what about retouch with the clone stamp tool? Retouch with the clone stamp tool. The clone stamp tool paints one part of an image over another part of the same image over another part of any open document that has the same color mode, by the way. And you can also paint part of one layer over another layer. And the clone stamp tool is useful, by the way, for duplicating objects or removing a defect in an image. And you can also use the clone stamp tool to paint content on video or animation frames. And to use the clone stamp tool, you set a sampling point on the area you want to copy and clone the pixels from the paint over another area. And to paint with the most current sampling point whenever you stop and resume painting, select the aligned option and deselect the aligned option to paint starting from the initial sampling point, no matter how many times you stop and resume painting. And you can also use any brush tip with the clone stamp tool, which gives you precise control over the size of the cloned area. And you can also use opacity and flow settings to control the paint application to the cloned area, like the next screenshot, the next picture now explain for you. Altering an image with the clone stamp tool, and we have steps here now. Step number 1, you should select the clone stamp tool. After that, step number 2, choose a brush tip and set brush options for the blending mode and opacity and flow in the options bar. Step number 3, to specify how you want to align the sampling pixels and how to sample data from the layers in your document. Set any of the following in the options bar. And so what about aligned samples pixels continuously without losing the current sampling point? And even if you release the mouse button, deselect aligned to continue to use the sampled pixels from the initial sampling point each time you stop and resume painting. So what about sample? Sample is meaning that samples data from the layers you specify. To sample from the active layer and visible layers bluet, and you get to choose current and blue to sample only from the active layer, and choose current layer to sample from all visible layers, and then choose all layers to sample from all visible layers except adjustment layers, and then choose all layers and click the ignore adjustment layers icon to the right of the sample pop-up menu. Step number 4, you can set the sampling point by positioning the pointer in any open image and alt-clicking if you use Windows or option-clicking if you use macOS. Note and be careful, you can to make sure you are not working on an adjustment layer, and the clone stamp tool doesn't work on adjustment layers, by the way. Step number 5, optional. In the clone source panel, you should to click a clone source button and set an additional sampling point. And you can set up to 5 different sampling sources, by the way. And the clone source panel saves the sampled sources until you close the document. Step number 6. Optional again. Do any of the following in the clone source panel. To scale or rotate the sources that you are cloning, enter a value for W width or H height or the rotation in degrees. And to reverse the direction of the source, good for mirroring features like eyes, and click the flip horizontal or flip vertical buttons. And to show an overlay of the source that you are cloning, select show overlay and then specify the overlay options. Note and be careful, select clipped to clip the overlay to the brush size. Step number 7. Drag over the area of the image you want to correct. Set sample sources for cloning and healing. Set sample sources for cloning and healing. By the way, using the clone stamp or healing brush tool, you can sample sources in the current document or any open document in Photoshop. And when cloning video or animation, you can set sampling points in the current frame you are painting or sample sources in a different frame. And even if the frame is in a different video, layer or in a different open document. And you can also set up to 5 different sampling sources at a time in the clone source panel. And the clone source panel saves the sampling sources until you close the document. And to clone video or animations frames, you should open the animation panel. And if you are not cloning video or animation frames, skip to step 2. And then select the timeline animation option and move the current time indicator to the frame with the source you want to sample. Step number 2. To set the sampling point, select the clone stamp tool and alt click if you use Windows or option click if you use macOS in any open document window. Step number 3. Optional again. To set another sampling point, click a different clone source button in the clone source panel, and you can change the sampling source for a clone source button by setting a different sampling point. Scale or rotate. How to scale or rotate the sample source. How to scale or rotate the sample source. We have steps again here now. Step number 1. You should to select the clone stamp or healing brush tool and set one or more source samples. And step number 2. In the clone source panel, select the clone source and then do any of the following. To scale the sample source, enter a percentage value for W width or H height or scrub W or H. And the default is to constrain proportions and to adjust the dimensions independently or restore the constrain option. Click the maintain aspect ratio button. And to rotate the sample source, enter a degree, value or scrub the rotate the clone source icon. And to reset the sample source to its original size and orientation, click the reset transform button. What about adjust the sample source overlay options? Adjust the sample source overlay options. Adjust the sample source overlay options to see the overlay and underlying images better when painting with the clone stamp and healing brush tools. To temporarily display the overlay while painting with the clone stamp tool, press Alt Shift if you use Windows or Option Shift if you use macOS. And the brush changes temporarily to the Move Source Overlay tool. Drag to move the overlay to another location. And in the clone source panel, select Show Overlay and do any of the following. To hide the overlay while you apply the paint strokes, select Auto Hide. And to clip the overlay to the brush size, enable the clipped option. And to set the opacity of the overlay, enter a percentage value in the opacity text box. And to set the appearance of the overlay, you should to choose either the normal and darken and lighten or difference blending mode from the pop-up menu at the bottom of the clone source panel. And after that, to invert the colors in the overlay, you should to select invert. And to help align identical areas in the source overlay and underlying image, you should to set opacity to 50% and then select invert. invert and deselect clipped and matching image areas will appear, by the way, solid gray when aligned. How to specify the clone source offset? By the way, when using the clone stamp tool or healing brush tool, you can paint with the sampled source anywhere in the target image, and these overlay options help you visualize where you want to paint. However, if you paint in a specific location relative to the sampling point, you can specify the X and Y pixel offset. And in the clone source panel, you should select the source you want to use and enter the X and Y pixel values for the offset option. How to retouch with healing brush tool? Retouch with healing brush tool. Note, beginning with the Photoshop CC 2015.5 release, you have an option now to revert to the legacy Photoshop CC 2014 behavior for the healing brush tool and select preferences, then select tools, then select use legacy healing algorithm for healing brush. And the healing brush tool lets you, by the way, correct imperfections, causing them to disappear into the surrounding image. And like the cloning tools, you can use the healing brush tool to paint with sampled pixels from an image or pattern. However, the healing brush tool also matches the texture and lighting and transparency and shading of the sampled pixels to the pixels being held. As a result, the repaired pixels blend seamlessly into the rest of the image. And the healing brush tool, by the way, can be applied to video or animation frames, like this image, this screenshot now. This image now explain sampled pixels and healed image, and you have steps. Step number 1, you should select the healing brush tool in this image, and after that, step number 2, click the brush sample in the options bar and set brush options in the pop menu. In the pop panel. And note and be careful. If you are using a pure sensitive digitizing tape tablet, it choose an option from the size menu to vary the size of the healing brush over the course of a stroke. Then choose brand brochure to base the variation on the pen brochure, and then choose stylus wheel to base the variation on the position of the pen thumb wheel, and choose off if you don't want to vary the size. And you have options here now. We have many options actually. Option number 1, mood. What's the meaning of mood? Mood is meaning that you can specify the blending mood and choose replace to preserve noise and film grain and texture at the edges of the brush stroke when using a soft edge brush. And next option, source. Source is meaning specifies the source to use for repairing pixels, and sampled to use pixels from the current image, by the way, or pattern to use pixels from a pattern. And if you choose pattern, select a pattern from the pattern panel. And next option, aligned. Aligned is meaning samples pixels continuously and without losing the current sampling point, even if you release the mouse button and deselect aligned to continue to use the sampled pixels from the initial sampling point each time you stop and resume painting. And what about sample? Sample is meaning samples data from the layers you specify to sample from the active layer and visible layers below it, and choose current and blue to sample only from the active layer, and choose current layer to sample from all visible layers, by the way, and then choose all layers to sample from all visible layers except adjustment layers, and then choose all layers and click the ignore adjustment layers icon to the right of the sample pop-up menu. So what about diffusion? Diffusion is meaning that controls how quickly the pasted region adapts to the surrounding image, and select a lower value for images with grain or fine details, or a higher value for smooth images. Step number 3. Set the sampling point by positioning the pointer over an area of the image and Alt click if you use Windows or Option click if you use macOS. Note and be careful in this point. If you are sampling from one image and applying to another, Both images, by the way, must be in the same color mode, unless one of the images in the grayscale mode. Step number 4. Step number 4, optional. In the clone source panel, by the way, you should click a clone source button and then set an additional sampling point. And you can set up to 5 different sampling sources, by the way, and the clone source panel remembers the sampled sources until you close the document you are editing. Step number 5, optional again. In the clone source panel, click a clone source button to select the sampled source you want. Step number 6, optional. Do any of the following in the clone source panel. You should to scale or rotate the source that you are cloning and enter a value for W width or H height or the rotation in degrees. And after that, to show an overlay of the source that you are cloning, select how overlay and specify the overlay options. Step number 7, drag in the image. The sampled pixels are melded with the existing pixels each time you release the mouse button, by the way. And if there is a strong contrast at the edges of the area you want to heal, make a selection before you use the healing brush tool. And the selection should be bigger than the area you want to heal and precisely follow the boundary of contrasting pixels. And when you paint with the healing brush tool, the selection prevents colors from bleeding in from the outside. What about retouch? Retouch with the spot healing brush tool. By the way, the spot healing brush tool quickly removes blemishes and other imperfections in your photos. And the spot healing brush works similarly to the healing brush. It paints with sampled pixels from an image or pattern and matches the texture and lighting, transparency and shading of the sampled pixels to the pixels being healed. And unlike the healing brush, the spot healing brush doesn't require you to specify a sample spot, by the way. And the spot healing brush automatically samples from around the retouched area. Like the next screenshot, the next image appear for you and explain using the spot healing brush to remove a blemish. And for retouching a large area or for more control over the source sampling, you can use the healing brush instead of the spot healing brush. We have steps. Step number 1. Select the spot healing brush tool from the toolbox and if necessary, click either the healing brush tool and patch tool or red eye tool to show the hidden tools and make your selection. Step number 2. You can choose a brush size in the options bar and a brush that is slightly larger than the area you want to fix. Works best so that you can cover the entire area with one click. Step number 3. Optional. You can choose a blending mode from the mode menu in the options bar and choose replace to preserve noise, film, grain and texture at the edges of the brush stroke when using a soft edge brush. Step number 4. You can choose a type option in the options bar, and we have options here again in this tab. Proximity match is meaning uses pixels around the edge of the selection to find an area to use as a patch. Create texture is meaning that uses pixels in the selection to create a texture, and if that texture doesn't work, try dragging through the area a second time. Content aware is meaning compares nearby image content to seamlessly fill the selection, realistically maintaining key details such as shadows and object edges, and create a larger or more precise selection for the content aware option. Use the edit then choose fill command in this point. Step number 5. Select sample. Select sample all layers in the options bar to sample data from all visible layers, and deselect sample all layers to sample only from the active layer. Step number 6. You should click the area you want to fix, or click and drag to smooth over imperfections in a larger area. So what about retouching cars in Photoshop? Retouching cars in Photoshop. Patch an area. So what about patch an area? By the way, the patch tools lets you repair a selected area with pixels from another area or a pattern, like the healing brush tool. And the patch tool actually matches the texture, lighting and shading of the sampled pixels to the source pixels. And you can also use the patch tool to clone isolated areas of an image. And the patch tool works with 8 bytes or 16 bytes per channel images, by the way. And when repairing, reminder here, when repairing with pixels from the image, select a small area to produce the best result. Like this image now, using the patch tool to replace pixels. And this image again, patched image. And repair an area using sampled pixels. What about repair an area using sampled pixels? We have steps. Step number 1, you should select the patch tool. And step number 2, you should drag in the image to select the area you want to repair, and select source in the options bar. And next, you should drag in the image to select the area from which you want to sample, and then select destination in the options bar. Note and be careful, you can also make a selection prior to selecting the patch tool, by the way. Step number 3, to adjust the selection, do one of the following. You should to shift drag in the image to add to the existing selection, and also should to alt drag if you use Windows, then press options drag if you use macOS in the image to subtract from the existing selection. After that, you should to click alt shift drag if you use Windows, or option shift drag if you use macOS in the image to select an area intersected by the existing selection. Step number 4, to extract texture. To extract texture with a transparent background from the sampled area. What should you do? You should select transparent firstly, and then deselect this option if you want to fully replace the target area with the sampled area. And the transparent options, by the way, works best for solid or gradient backgrounds with clearly distanced textures, such as appeared in a blue sky. Step number 5, to control how quickly the pasted region adapts to the surrounding image, adjust the diffusion slider. Select a lower value for images with grain or fine details, or a higher value for smooth images. Step number 6, position the pointer inside the selection, and do one of the following. If source is selected in the options bar, you should drag the selection border to the area from which you want to sample. And when you release the mouse button, the originally selected area is patched, by the way, with sampled pixels. After that, if destination is selected in the options bar, what should you do? You should drag the selection border to the area you want to patch. When you release the mouse button, and the newly selected area is patched actually with the sampled pixels. So what about repair an area? Repair an area using a pattern. Repair an area using a pattern. We have a steps. Step number 1, you should select the patch tool firstly. After that, step number 2, drag in the image to select the area you want to repair. And note and be careful, you can also make a selection prior to selecting the patch tool, by the way. And step number 3, if desired, complete steps 3 and 4 above to adjust the selection and apply pattern texture with a transparent background. And step number 4, select a pattern from the pattern panel in the options bar and click use pattern. Remove red eye. How to remove a red eye? If you find red eye, how to remove the red eye? Removing red eye and whitening teeth. Removing the red eye and whitening teeth. How? By the way, the red eye tool removes red eye in flash photos of people or animals. We have steps. Step number 1. To remove the red eye. In RGB color mode, you should select the red eye tool. Then the red eye tool is in the same groups as the spot healing brush tool. And hold down a tool to display additional tools in the group. Step number 2. Click in the red eye. If you are not satisfied with the result, undo the correction and set one or more of the following options in the options bar, and then click the red eye again. We have options. Bubble size. So what's the meaning of bubble size? Bubble size is the meaning increases or decreases the area affected by the red eye tool. And darken amount. Darken amount is the meaning such the darkness of the correction. And be careful. A reflection of the camera flash in the subject retina causes red eye, by the way. And you will see it more often when taking pictures in a darkened room because the subject is wide open. And to avoid red eye, use the camera's red eye reduction feature. Or better yet, and use a separate flash unit that you can mount on the camera further away from the camera's lens. So what about correct image distortion and noise? Correct image distortion and noise. About lens distortion. Barrel distortion is a lens defect that causes straight lines to pull out toward the edges of the image. And Benchian distortion in the opposite effect, where straight lines beyond inwards. Like this image now. Look at this screenshot, this image now. We have in the left side examples of barrel distortion, and in the right side it's Benchian distortion. And by the way, vignetting is a defect that darkens the corners of an image due to light fall off around the perimeter of the lens. And chromatic aberration appears as a color fraying along the edges of objects, and caused by the lens focusing on different colors of light in different planes. And some lenses exhibit different defects. As certain focal lenses, by the way, f-stops and focus distances. And with the lens correction filter, you can specify the combination of settings used to make the image. So what about correct lens distortion and adjust perspective? What about correct lens distortion and adjust perspective? By the way, the lens correction filter fixes common lens flaws such as barrel and Benchian distortion and vignetting and chromatic aberration. And the filter works only with 8 and 16 bytes per channel images in RGB or grayscale mode. And you can also use the filter to rotate an image or fix image perspective caused by vertical or horizontal camera tilt. And the filter's image grid makes these adjustments easier and more accurate than using the transform command. Automatically correct image perspective and lens flaws. Automatically correct image perspective and lens flaws. By the way, using lens profiles, the default auto correction option quickly and accurately fixes distortion. And for proper automatic correction, Photoshop requires EXIF metadata that identifies the camera and lens that created the image, by the way, and a matching lens profile on your system. We have steps. Step number 1, should to choose filter, then choose lens correction. Step number 2, set the following options now. Correction. What's the meaning of correction? Select the problems you want to fix. If corrections understandably extend or contract the image but beyond original dimensions, select auto scale image, by the way. And the edge menu specifies how to handle blank areas that result from punctuation, rotation, or perspective corrections. You can fill blank areas with transparency or a color, or you can extend the edge pixels of the image, by the way. So what about search criteria? Search criteria, what's meaning? Its meaning filters the lens profiles list. By default, profiles based on image sensor size appear first, and to list raw profiles first, click the pop menu, then and select prefer raw profiles. So what about lens profiles? What's the meaning of lens profiles? Lens profiles is meaning that you should select a matching profile. By default, Photoshop displays only profiles that matches the camera and lens used to create the image, and the camera model doesn't have to match perfectly. And Photoshop also automatically selects a matching sub-profile for the selected lens based on focal length and stop and focus distance. And to change the automatic selection, right-click the current lens profile and select a different sub-profile, by the way. And if you find no matching lens profile, you should click search online to acquire additional profiles created by the Photoshop community. And to store online profiles for future use, click the pop-up menu, then and choose Save Online Profile locally. And for tips for working with lens profiles and a list of supported lenses, see the support article, Lens Profile Support. To create custom profiles, use the Adobe Lens Profile Creator. So what about manually? Manually correct image perspective and lens flows. By the way, you can apply manually correction alone or use it to refine automatic lens correction. We have steps. Step number 1. You should choose filter, then choose lens correction. Step number 2. In the upper right corner of the dialog box, you should click the custom tab. And step number 3. Optional again. Choose a preset list of settings from the setting menu, and lens default uses setting that you are previously saved for the camera lens and focal length. And focus distance used to create the image, and the previous conversion uses the setting used in your last lens correction, by the way. And any group of custom settings you saved are listed at the bottom of the menu. Step number 4. You should set any of the following options to correct your image. We have options here now. Remove distortion. What's the meaning of remove distortion? It's meaning corrects lens parallel or punctuation distortion, and move the slider and move the slider to straighten horizontal and vertical lines that beyond either away from or toward the center of the image. And you can also use the remove distortion tool to make this correction and drag toward the center of the image to correct for parallel distortion, and toward the edge of the image to correct the punctuation distortion, and to compensate for any blank image edges. The result adjusts the edge option on the auto correction tab. And what about fixed frame setting? Fixed frame setting, what's the meaning? It's meaning that compensate for framing by adjusting the size of one color channel relative to another, and zoom in on the image preview to get a closer view of the framing as you make the correction. So what's the meaning of Viganti amount? Viganti amount is meaning such as the amount of lightening or darkening along the edges of an image, and corrects images that have darkened corners caused by lens faults or improper lens shading. And you can also apply Viganti for a creative effect. So what about Viganti midpoint? It's meaning that you can specify the width of area affected by the amount slider, and specify a lower number to affect more of the image, and specify a higher number to restrict the effect to the edges of the image. And so what about vertical perspective? Vertical perspective is meaning correct this image perspective caused by tilting to the camera up or down, and makes vertical lines in an image parallel So what about horizontal perspective? Horizontal perspective is meaning correct this image perspective, making horizontal lines parallel. And what's meaning of angle? Angle is meaning rotates the image to correct for camera tilt or to make adjustments after correcting perspective. And you can also use the straighten tool to make this correction and drag along a line in the image that you want to make vertical or horizontal. And be careful to avoid unintended scaling when adjusting perspective or angle setting. Deselect auto scale image on the auto correction tab. And what's the meaning of scale? Scale is meaning adjusts the image scale up or down, and the image pixel dimensions aren't changed by the way. And the main use is to remove blank areas of the image caused by punctuation, rotation, or perspective corrections. And scaling up effectively results in cropping the image and interpolating up to the original pixel dimensions. And what about adjust the lens correction preview and grid? What about adjust the lens correction preview and grid? By the way, adjust the preview, magnification and grid lines to better judge the necessary amount of correction. And to change the image preview magnification, use the zoom tool or the zoom controls in the lower left side of the preview image. After that, to move the image in the preview window, you should select the hand tool and drag in the image preview. After that, you can use the grid select show grid at the bottom of the dialog box, and you should use the size control to adjust the grid spacing and the color control to change the color of the grid. And you can also move the grid to line it up with your image using the move grid tool. So what about save setting and set camera and lens defaults? Save setting and set camera and lens defaults. You can also save the setting in the lens correction dialog box to reuse with other images made with the same camera, by the way, camera lens. And the focal length, Photoshop, by the way, saves both auto correction setting and custom setting for distortion and chromatic and aberration and vignetting and perspective correction setting are not saved because they typically vary from one image to another. And you can save and reuse setting in two ways, by the way. Number one, manually save and load setting and set options in the dialog box, and then choose save setting from the setting menu. To use the saved setting, choose them from the setting menu, and if you save setting outside the default folder, they don't appear, by the way, in the menu, and use the load setting command to access them. And after that, you can set a lens default if your image has EXIF metadata for the camera and lens focal length. And f-stop, you can save the current setting as a lens default, and to save the setting you should click the set lens default button. And after that, when you correct an image that matches the camera lens, focal length and f-stop, the lens, by the way, default options becomes available in the setting menu. This option, by the way, is not available. This option is not available actually if your image doesn't have EXIF metadata. What about reduce image noise and GPG artifacts? What about reduce image noise and GPG artifacts? Image noise appears as random extraneous pixels that aren't part of the image detail, and the noise can be caused by photographing with a high ISO setting on a digital camera, by the way, under exposure, or shooting in a dark area with a long shutter speed. Low-end consumer cameras usually exhibit more image noise than high-end cameras, and scanned images may have image noise caused by the scanning sensor, by the way, and often the film's grain pattern appears in the scanned image. And image noise can appear, by the way, in two forms: luminance grayscale noise, which makes an image look grainy or patchy, and color noise, which is usually visible as colored artifacts in the image. And luminance noise may be more pronounced in one channel of the image, and usually the blue channel you can adjust the noise for each channel separately in advanced mode. And before opening the filter, examine each channel in your image separately to see if noise is prevalent in one channel or not, and you preserve more image detail by correcting one channel rather than making an overall correction to all channels. We have steps here now again. Step number 1, choose filter, then choose noise, then choose reduce noise. Step number 2, zoom in on the preview image to get a better view of image noise. Step number 3, set options. We have options here. Strength is meaning that controls the amount of luminance noise reduction applied to all image channels. And preserve details is meaning preserves edges and image details such as hair or texture objects, and a value of 100 preserves the most image detail, by the way, but reduces luminance noise the least, and balance the strength and preserve details controls to fine-tune noise reduction. So what's the meaning of reduce color noise? Reduce color noise is meaning that removes random color pixels, and higher value reduces more color noise. So what's the meaning of sharpen details? Sharpen details is meaning it sharpens the image, removing noise reduces image sharpness. And use the sharpening control in the dialog box, or use one of the other Photoshop sharpening filters later to restore sharpness. So what's the meaning of remove JPG artifacts? Remove JPG artifacts is meaning removes blocky image artifacts and halos caused by saving an image using a low JPG quality setting. Step number 4, if luminance noise is more prevalent in one or two color channels, you should click the advanced button firstly and then choose the color channel from the channel menu. And you can use also the strength and preserve details controls to reduce noise in that channel.